All right. I got first time guest here introduced to me by Pete Quinones, Jay Burden. But before that, it's that time of year again. It is the Libertarian Institute Fund Drive. If you want to keep the podcast going, all the writers funded, and all the books coming, you got to go to the libertarianinstitute.org/donate and give us your money. That's the fund drive at the libertarianinstitute.org. Keep us rolling. We're a 501c3. Everything is done by donation. So give me your money. And I am happy to say that I have I'm a new affiliate with ALP. And this is extremely important to me. In May of 2024, I made a huge step. I quit smoking. I realized after 28 years of smoking cigarettes, my quality of life had diminished significantly. I couldn't completely, like menial task would just take the breath from me. I would just have shortness of breath, shallow breathing. I had just had enough. It was a real problem. It was really affecting my day-to-day life. But as smokers know, quitting is a big decision. Over the years, you reflexively begin to make decisions around your ability to feed your habit. You become a slave to your vice. This is when I began utilizing nicotine pouches. All the nicotine, none of the shallow breathing. It's a win-win. Now I'm proud to announce Year Zero is an affiliate of ALP nicotine pouches. ALP is by far the best nicotine pouch that I've tried since embarking on a smokeless life. Its long-lasting flavor and burst of nicotine satisfy my cravings for hours at a time. It comes in a variety of flavors. My go-to is the wintergreen. I got one in right now. Check the description of this podcast for a link that allows you to set up recurring orders, delivering ALP satisfaction to your door and get 10% off your order. If you're looking for all the benefits of straight nicotine without the tar and chemicals of cigarettes, I can't recommend ALP more. Your lungs will thank you, your breath will thank you, and your wallet will thank you. If you place an order of $70 or more, you will also be rewarded with free shipping. That's 5 logs or 15 cans recurring each month with free shipping and 10% off your purchase when you use the link in the description. If you're done with tobacco but love nicotine, click the link in the description and get your ALP shipped out to you today. Back to the show. All right, Jay, what's up, dude?
Yeah, man, thanks for having me on. I'm looking forward to it. It's always fun, right, when you get connected by friends because the internet's a big place, and I'm continually astounded by guys I really like and guys I get along with who I've just never come across. So I'm really glad to be formally making your acquaintance, man.
Yeah, yeah, no doubt. I remember hearing you on Pete's show a couple of years ago, I guess, when I was still driving over the road and I had a lot more time to listen to podcasts. Now I'm just so limited on time because I'm local and dealing with stores and managers and unloading all the time that I can't stay on the podcast in the podcast circuit listening for long periods like I used to. But yeah, it's great. It's great to have a chance to talk to you. And as I was telling you before, I told Pete the subject I wanted to talk about. You were the first name that popped up, and he immediately started a chat between the three of us and introduced us. And yeah, we have made it happen, and I think this is going to be a lot of fun.
Yeah, man, I'm definitely looking forward to it. I just want a brief aside. I think that interview on Pete's show was one of the first interviews that I ever did. And look, like you know this format. Sitting on one side of the chair is dramatically different than sitting on the other. And so that's one of those ones I look back on and I'm like, you know what, not my best performance, but you know what, you get better at it. That's the good thing about it. And yeah, man, I'm looking forward to this conversation because I think it's an interesting topic and one that needs to be addressed.
Yeah, it's funny because the I I was the first person to ever interview Top Lobster, and look what he's done. He's become like all he has what like he's in on like 4 podcasts now or something like that. He's all over the place. So yeah, it's wild. Like when you see people kind of hit hit that stride and they really like, oh wow, I can do this and I can be good at it. I'm still trying to figure out how to be good at it. So, don't hold me too high of a standard.
Well, obviously, this is not what we came here to discuss, but I think that's one of the most gratifying things, right? Is someone who, and not to say discovered, right? But you were kind of their first big break. And then to
Right.
see them, go on, it's incredibly, it's really incredibly satisfying, right? Because if you're kind of operating more on the bush league ends of podcasting, right, where you kind of split the difference between, established figures and up and comers, it's really fun, right? When you pick a winner, right? You see a guy and you're
Right.
like, oh, this guy needs an audience. He's really smart. He's got interesting ideas, but he just no one's listening to him. And if you're the like, the sort of catalyst, right? The like the initial spark that can get them up and going. I mean, there's not much better than that, right?
Well, what was funny about Danny, and again, this is not our subject, but what was funny about Danny was he had a large following already because he was designing T-shirts and stuff, and people were following him all over Twitter. I think at the time he already had like 15,000 followers or something like that on Twitter when I interviewed him, and I didn't realize he had never been on a show before. And so, it's like, oh wow, okay. But yeah, no, he's a hilarious guy. He's a lot of fun. And I love chatting with people who just like to talk shit and also know what they're talking about,
Yeah, yeah.
because it brings levity to some of these really, really dark subjects that we dig into sometimes.
Yeah, no, there's definitely something to that, and it's a hard needle to thread, right? Because there are a great many of our compatriots that are incredibly serious, and while I get it, look, like we're talking about very serious things, you can sort of hit an overload with that, right? Where
Yeah.
it's blackpilling, and obviously the counter to blackpilling is not to become Pollyanna, not to say everything's fine, we're going to win easily, right? But it's to look at the situation soberly, and I think that a little bit of gallows humor can really help with that, right? Because look, like certainly the situation is grim, and well, don't get me wrong, it is less grim than it was relatively recently. There's still very, very real problems at hand. Well, just doom and gloom whining about it, it's not particularly healthy or helpful. And there is a trap in despair, right? I think of Pilgrim's Progress, right? The Slough of Despond, right? Which is this
Mm-hmm.
like, it's basically the swamp of black pilling,
Mm-hmm.
and people get stuck there. And so, again, it's a difficult thing to do. You have to, walk and chew gum at the same time, but, the truth isn't easy. And I think it's definitely something that, we on the online right have certainly struggled with.
Yeah. That that's a really good point because I notice sometimes I'll get into a podcast because the information is so interesting, but it's delivered so with such a weight on it that it becomes overwhelming to me to listen to it for a long period of time. And I one of the things I try to do is I try to remember like I'm just a truck driver. I'm just a truck driver who bought a microphone and hooked it up to a computer. And so I try to remember to talk to everybody or to talk to my audience as if I'm just sitting with a friend at the bar having a beer. And so there's going to be some of that dark humor that pops in, and there's going to be some you know off-colored topics and subjects that we're going to get into. But the goal of it is to record the happenings of the day, the thoughts that are occurring to us, and to find a way to uplift and educate at the same time.
Yeah, and that's a very important thing, right? Which is to say, like, well, why are we doing this? Like, why do you and I both have podcasts? And I mean, like at the most basic level, I enjoy it, right? It's a hobby, it's fun. There's a very small amount that's technically an economic decision, right? I don't make a ton of money, but
Yeah.
it helps. But I think on the other level, right, if you're serious about like, politics and you're serious about kind of like the ultimate questions, it's an important thing to ask yourself. And I think the answer, right, is twofold, which is one, uh, for the audience, right, this is information that can be useful, right? Like in how you actually live your life, how you index with reality. There's a certain amount of it that's entertainment, right? If people didn't
Hmm.
enjoy listening to you, they wouldn't. But I think one of the other things that we've realized, particularly in the second Trump administration, is there are important people listening to what we are saying. And to if you are primarily interested in power projection, right? If you are a pundit, the thing that matters is effectively how elite your audience is, right? So you have someone like Alex Jones who has a massive audience, right? He rakes in tons of money, but the things Alex Jones thinks don't matter, right? To the people in power. They
Mm.
view him as at best a sort of comedic figure. Now, alternately, right, you look at someone like Tucker, who admittedly also has a massive audience, but Tucker seemingly has a direct line to the president's desk. If not that, he certainly has a ton of influence. And you see that in the form of, well, Mike Pompeo puts himself forward as, I believe, Secretary of State, right? Then allegedly, but I see no reason not to believe it, Tucker Carlson calls Trump and says, don't do it. And now Mike Pompeo isn't in government. So that's
Hmm.
obviously the maximal end of it. But all the time, right, we see our friends, right, we see their ideas echoed from powerful people, right? You have someone like J.D. Vance, who, when talking about immigration, brings up the Order of Morris, right, from Augustine. And while certainly, there's a possibility he just reads a lot of Augustine, I don't want to take that away from him. But those talking points have been around, the internet, right, expressed exactly how he expressed them for a couple years now. And that's just
Hmm.
one example to hand. There are others. But, right, effectively, we're in a situation where at least some of, the kind of rich and powerful people are listening to us. And, really that matters a whole lot more than the, couple $100 you might make off your podcast or the 10,000 viewers on YouTube or anything like that. Like
Right.
that's where this actually matters. And look, like I'm not trying to make a populist point of we need to convince 50 plus 1% of people that we're right at all. What I'm saying is if you have captured in any small way, right, the audience of people who make decisions, well, that's an incredibly powerful thing. And I'll use an example, right? We have friends in common who will not be named, who have told me I'm on, XYZ platform. I can see who is listening or reading to my show and will rattle off, half a dozen highly influential people in government, right?
Hmm.
So to me, that indicates that, the messages that are coming out of this space are being listened to. And
Yep.
similarly, right, the answer is, well, why? Okay, maybe we're just ultra entertaining. That's a distinct possibility. I think I'm pretty great. But really, right, the actual thing is that there's an information advantage here, right? The ideas that we're talking about provide you an edge. It can explain things that CNN and MSNBC can't explain. And I think that's the reason why you see more and more private equity, right? People who literally make lots of money off of having an information advantage interested in things like what we're saying. So anyway, that was a very long preamble, but nonetheless, why I think it's actually worthwhile, talking and having a podcast, right?
Yeah. No, well, and you bring up a good point, and I mean, this is all drawing us into the subject at hand. So, for the audience, don't think that we're just rambling here. There's we're heading in a direction. I want to ask you something before we dive in to the main subject. How do you break up the political moment, right? So you have this scenario to where people who are seemingly what we would call left of center, like RFK Jr., Tulsi Gabbard, who are now within the scope of our political alignment with the Trump administration. I hear people constantly talk about how, well, I was a Biden supporter until the debate, and then I couldn't vote for Kamala, so then I ended up voting for Trump. And I've heard several people echo that sentiment um, throughout this. And I'm trying to look at it. It doesn't seem like there's a natural left and right anymore. It seems like it's all kind of it's like a toddler's coloring book, man. It's all just kind of squiggly lines and crossing over each other, and everybody's kind of mashed together um, in these weird alignments where you see like the Cheneys aligning with Democrats, and you have, these populist leftists like Tulsi Gabbard aligning with Donald Trump. Is it like an establishment versus non-establishment, or what are we actually looking at as far as the political landscape goes at the moment?
So sure. First of all, I want to say that this is not new, right? Political alignments change, particularly after the facts on the ground change.
Hmm.
A lot has been made of Trump's parallels to Nixon, and I think that that's more true than many people realized. Right? Obviously, you have what he's doing, with currency that is from a certain perspective kind of Nixonian, but also what Nixon did is he fundamentally redefined the political voting blocks. Right? You even hear progressives talk about the great party switch, quote unquote.
Hmm.
Basically, what they're talking about is that the facts on the ground had changed. The Republican Party, it changed who its core demographic was. Similarly, so did the Democrats. Really earlier, honestly, due to what LBJ did. But similarly, what I think you see happening now is that really at the genesis of this, like 20 years ago, the Democrats abandoned one of their core voting blocks, right, which was basically working class unionized whites, right, that kind of skilled labor. And that had been a Democratic voting bloc for, decades before. And, when they abandoned that, they sort of slowly over a couple generations, right, adopted what I want to call like the Rainbow Coalition, which we can refer to as kind of like the woke coalition that you see, typified in someone like Obama. And that campaign promise was never explicitly stated, but it was basically, uh, gays, okay, let's say sexual minorities, racial minorities, women against white people, right? That's basically the deal that he made. And so what that produced was, a counterpunch, right? That produced a reaction. Obviously, we saw the early elements of this in something like the Tea Party that eventually became MAGA. And what you see with MAGA is, I've now said it both ways, right? This sort of, evolved voter base, right? And before I get into this, I want to just say Donald Trump is the first president I've ever voted for. I feel quite good in that decision based off what he's done, but I'm not, a MAGA maximalist, right? I don't think this is what saves us, and I have significant issues with that base. Now, similarly, right, we have a voter base change, but even more importantly, we have an elite change, right? The traditional client group of the Republican Party, which was this kind of combination of like high finance and the MIC, right? They swapped over, right? A lot of those people went with Obama. There's a reason that Obama was, using drone strikes and got a whole lot of donations from, big banks you've heard of. Well, again, right, that's going to create a need for something else. So Trump, the first time around, had some, but really not a lot of elite backing. Teal gave him some money. But what we've seen in, the second time around, or I guess the third, depending on how you look at it, right, is he has new friends, right? And there are a couple groups there, some of which are new, right? Like you have, kind of like the tech bro lobby, the Peter Thiel and co. You also have this kind of mysterious third group, which is people like, Tucker Carlson, people like the kind of like, when you call it like older school deep state, right? Who you'd see on like Judge Knapp's show, those kind of people, that's a power block, or at least it seems to be. And then you have old reliable, right? My favorite Mediterranean country, which for the sake of censors will remain unsaid, but if you're a smart kid, you can figure it out. So now you have both a different voter base, right? That's shifted over the last couple decades. And also you have not only different, power blocks, right? Different elites behind it, but now you have three of them, right? And as we know, right, a three body system is inherently unstable, right? There's no
Hmm.
predictable orbit for those. And so I think that looking forward, what I'm really interested to see is, well, how do disagreements between those three groups shake out? Because one of the things that we saw is, well, it seems like the tech bros get their way in some things, but on H-1B visas, they don't, right? They got slapped down hard on that. So that indicates that they don't get everything they want. I know
Hmm.
there's been some kind of doom and gloom on the Israel front, but we haven't really seen, a hardcore crisis between, the Israel lobby and the tech lobby, or the Israel lobby and that mysterious third group. That's kind of an
Hmm.
open question. But they're also not getting everything they wanted, right? They didn't get Mike Pompeo. They were really, really mad when Trump sent, I cannot remember his name, but sent, an envoy to meet with the Iranians. They weren't happy about that. And so to me, there are a lot of things in flux. And I think that that's a really interesting time, to be alive. And, one of the things that the reason I maintain, I'm cautiously optimistic is look, like, is Trump perfect? No. But the fact that there are at least three interested parties, that we can identify, not just one, that's good. And two, right, at least one of those seems to be explicitly hostile to the interests of the Israel lobby, right? And so, again, this isn't perfect, right? There are certainly things I disagree with Trump on. I don't agree with kind of Trump's kind of like social libertarian streak, but we're in much better circumstances than I really could have predicted. And again, Trump is doing something very good for us, which is effectively he is punishing our enemies and rewarding our friends. Right? So we're here to talk about the left, right? And one of the things that Trump and by extension Elon Musk has revealed is exactly how much of the left and our enemies are completely and totally artificial. Right? This wasn't an organic thing. They were literally getting paid by the government. Right? So you look at something like Christianity Today, right?
Hmm.
A pretty liberal Protestant rag. And when did they go hard left? Well, it turns out they go hard left right after they get a cool $1.8 million in USAID money, right? That's suspicious. And, that's just one to hand, but you can see, dozens of other examples of, crazy people getting lots of money to push far left causes. And it's that money's coming from us, right? It is literally, basic government corruption. So that's good, right? The fact that he's, firing federal workers, and we know exactly what federal workers are up to thanks to, Chris Rufo publishing the kind of like sordid deeds of the
Oh
NSA
man.
and CIA agents in their private
I
chat
was gonna
rooms.
ask you about that. Yeah.
So point is, right, he's punishing those people, which is good. And so what I think is that, Trump is solving a lot of problems. I doubt he will solve all of them. And really that comes down to the fact that there are kind of two types of issues at play here. Right? There's the
Hmm.
first order ones, which is basically uh, we as a country are incredibly mismanaged, right? We have a lot of very stupid things that the government does that serious countries would not be up to, right? For instance, CIA agents talking about, getting the hair on their buttholes removed, right? On
Hmm.
government time. That's
Yeah.
not something that a serious country does. And I'm not trying to be deliberately shocking. That is probably the least objectionable thing revealed in those logs.
Yeah.
But on the other hand, right, you have what I consider like civilizational issues, right? The problem of being a civilization that seems to be in a multi-century decline. I don't think Trump solves those. Now, what I will say is if you are interested in solving those problems, Trump is making your life a lot easier, right? You are devoting less resources to, for instance, worrying that the FBI is going to, kick down your door and arrest you like they did to those, 80 octogenarian, pro-life protesters, right? That's helpful. But to me, that second order problem, that kind of like deep civilizational entropy, I don't see this as solving. I'd love to be
Hmm.
wrong, like genuinely, I'd love to be wrong. Even setting aside, right, my natural pessimism, I think one of the really deep problems that we're facing, right, is, the problem of the left. And, I know Moldbug has kind of fell out of fashion in recent months, but, he defines the left as effectively, equivalent to entropy, right, to decay. That is the force of entropy. And you see that in the way that the left has gained power, right? How do they get in charge? Well, basically, they find a social bond, they break it and use that to one, release power, right? Release political energy, but also now that broken bond is a place for the state to act, right? Which gives you two things. One, you get to decide now as the state, but also that creates a sinecure position, right? So for instance, the feminist movement broke down traditional relationships between men and women.
Hmm.
So, well, okay, now men and women have that, that their traditional framework for how they ought to act to one another broken. What do you need? Well, you need a whole lot of laws. You need Title IX, you need an HR department. And all of those things are ways in which the state makes decisions about your life. And also, all of those are now positions that government toadies get paid lots of money to do, right? So that's how they work. And so this question of like, well, what happens to the left? I mean, in the immediate term, they're certainly hurting, right? They are being punished, and I think that's a good thing, right? We're sort of this is the equivalent of right, like in boxing, like a body blow, right, where you're taking away your opponent's stamina, right? You're hurting their legs, and in the literal way, right, that many of these people would have been either activists or donators to certain candidates, they don't have money anymore, right? They don't have the
Hmm.
time to, politically agitate because they have to get real jobs. Uh, Now, does that solve the problem of the left writ large, that kind of deep civilizational entropy? I don't think so, right? Because if you look at the things, Trump does and says, many of them are still fundamentally liberal, right? Like look at the decision that Trump basically handed, striking down Roe versus Wade. I want to say first of all, that's a good thing, right? If nothing else, I would have voted for Trump because of that decision, right? But if you look at how it's phrased, it's still fundamentally a liberal option, right? It is based in the idea that you should have more choice on this matter, right? You should have more representation in this matter. And look, like that was a tactical victory. I'll take it. But I think that many of those same things that brought us to the current moment are, deeply buried within the kind of, the MAGA movement, right? The Republican movement. Now, I will say one of the exciting things about it is that it seems like Trump is basically blowing up the post-war consensus, at least when it comes to international affairs, right?
Hmm.
The what seems to be the deal on Ukraine uh, is very, very different, right? It is not what we would expect from the so-called rules-based international order. So there's a chance that Trump is sort of opening the door for something greater. And then also, right, that if we look at that kind of mysterious third power block behind the president, right, you have someone like, Tucker Carlson, who I'll pick as emblematic. Well, sure, he's still kind of, making motions towards the liberal roots of this country, but he's saying things that are really not too far off from out and out blood and soil nationalism, right? So I think that there is certainly an opportunity to transition this movement into something that is profoundly anti-liberal, that is actually, has the chance to kind of, I guess you could say, like revitalize Western civilization. But, you know, I don't know if that's what we have currently. So sorry, Tommy, that is a massive rant for me. Maybe you got more than you bargained for, but those are kind of my introductory thoughts.
That's a no. There were a lot of things there you touched on that I was like, yeah, I want to talk about that. I want to talk about that, and then you triggered some things in my head. So one of the things you triggered was I was I have been genuinely shocked that the country on on large is behind what Doge is doing and are completely taken aback by the discoveries in USAID, which is a subject I've talked about for a long time. I've been on USAID, I guess, since 2015 when Putin um, like uh, made it illegal for them to operate within Russia, because a lot of the right, you would hear like Glenn Beck and a lot of these guys talk about how Putin expelled George Soros, but he didn't expel George Soros per se. What he did is he expelled USAID and NGOs that operate under USAID, utilizing USAID's money. And George Soros was involved in a lot of those NGOs. So USAID was always, I always considered it as arm of the CIA in order to carry out operations in foreign countries. And it wasn't until I saw the George Floyd riots, and I did a podcast with Daniel McAdams, if you're familiar with him. I did a podcast with Daniel McAdams in 2022 or 2023 about how the entire uprising of the left had died down, and it looked like we had just gone through a color revolution that was funded by USAID, and we had this whole conversation about that. And when you start looking where the money for the BLM riots came from, it came from the Tides Foundation, which is an NGO that takes money directly from USAID. So I think people starting to see these links and connect these dots are genuinely shocked and genuinely disheartened by the way the money's been spent. And I was shocked by that because I thought more people were supportive of these causes. And it came comes to come to find out it wasn't the average citizen that's supporting these causes naturally or from a grassroots roots level. It's because the universities, the media, and the bureaucrats have been taken over by the left. And you don't need and I always thought in order to have like a populist left movement, like a Bernie Sanders type movement, you would need a lot of leftists on the ground. And so I was like, man, our entire citizenry is moving left. And then you start seeing, oh wait, after this last election, you're like, oh wait, okay, people are actually further right than I thought. And you can look around Europe and see these natural movements of the right start popping up around Orban, or you see it in Germany. Just had an election in parliament where they moved to the right. And I mean, Brexit was a big, I think Brexit probably was the first crack, the first fissure that like really opened up the opportunity for the right to start becoming more vocal in Europe and in America. But I mean, we've seen Bukele, Milei, Bolsonaro, all these guys are extremely popular from the right, and it's the bureaucratic operatives, the universities, the media that are demonizing them, not the citizenry. And so I was genuinely shocked about that. And then you, and so we were always, I always was under the assumption that politics is downstream of culture. But what I didn't realize is culture is downstream of the bureaucracies, the media, and the universities, and that they were in effect shaping the culture, which is what I think Rufo exposed was how much of the political bureaucracy is actually pushing the culture onto the United States and not dragging the culture from the citizenry into the government. Do you have any thoughts on any of that?
Yeah, I do. And honestly, this was kind of one of the most interesting things about it because, I, like you, had kind of thought a lot of this was true, right? Like it just didn't make sense to me, right? How can this be organic? Because, one of the things you see from, the detractors, right? People on the kind of like dirtbag left, the kind of like left wing independent media, is they will basically look at right wing independent media and say things like, oh, why does it look so crappy? Why do they have so many ads? Well, the answer is because it actually has to be economically viable, right? We have to pay for our own stuff. And the alternative question is, well, okay, well, if we have to, well, why does their stuff look so slick? Why does it look so good? Why don't they have ads on it? It shouldn't make sense, right? It should be, if it were a fair playing field, there would be, a bell curve. Well, it turns out the answer is the government was just paying them. They were just getting money to do this, right? To kind of echo state propaganda. And, I'm glad you brought up Soros, right? And I'm glad you brought up the Summer of Floyd because Scott Horton was recently on Pete Quinonez's show and talking about, Ukraine. And one of the things he mentioned was, this kind of pattern of, using NGOs to foment cultural revolutions, right? Basically setting up some kind of inciting incident, giving lots of money to, agitators of any kind. And, we see this very cleanly in other countries, right? So for instance, right, like, well, why isn't Russia a democracy? Well, Russia isn't a democracy because, they don't give money or they don't, appreciate Western NGO interests, right? And so what do? Well, we give money to, people like Pussy Riot, these kind of like extreme LGBTQ activists, because, they are enemies of the Russian state. They agitate, right? And, we see them as an enemy. And so that's the tactic. Similarly, right, what you're watching in Romania happen right now, right, where, someone gets elected, they find some kind of bizarre procedural reason that they can't be elected, or they, as we saw in our own country, manufacture, certain procedural outcomes. How's that for dodging YouTube censorship? Uh, and then, they basically engineer mass protests. And we've seen this playbook over and over and over again. And I think that, the move that the Trump admin has taken, which is not necessarily to fight, the kind of like head of the snake, right? But to go after the base, right? So again, similarly to fighting, right? They're not headhunting, right? They're punishing the body. They're going at the actual funding network for this. And I think that's
Hmm.
very, very smart. Again, one of the things that I see as a sign for hope is it seems like the people behind Trump, I'll put it like that, are taking this very, very seriously. This not just from the perspective of like, okay, what would be a smart tactic to demolish the traditional base of power for our enemy, which is basically, not to put too fine a point on it, the American deep state, right? Not to just do that, but also, one of the other interesting things has been the kind of, incredible saturation, right? That just like dozens and dozens of things back to back to back to back to back. And look, like you have someone like Stephen Miller very clearly saying why they're doing it. And the answer is they're doing it so that they can overwhelm resistance. Because one of the things, right, again, if we're talking about the left, that the left has done very, very successfully in recent years is basically find and pick battles, right? We are talking about this. We are not talking about this. And really, one of the things that, really kind of shows you who is the leader, right? Who is the kind of like primary party in any disagreement is basically who sets the terms for what is being discussed. So for instance, right, the very fact that, you know, trans athletes in women's sports is a discussion at all, well, that's basically a win, right? Because what you're doing is you've already accepted a number of premises from the previous culture war, and you are forcing your enemies to defend that, right? Like you're
Hmm.
basically getting conservatives to defend Title IX, right? Which is kind of a bizarre situation. And so the fact that this admin is basically not only going on the attack, but doing it in so many ways to that there really isn't a coordinated response to this. So again, if we're talking about the left, one of the interesting things I think will be, well, one, where does resistance crystallize, right? Like what is the actual, like the fights that they are willing to, go to the mat on? Because look, like we've seen some of that, right? We've seen, judges making certain blocks, but it seems as if, right, this might go to the Supreme Court, right? It seems like this might be something where we actually get a decision made that yes, the president can do this, uh, which would honestly be pretty interesting. I don't know how that shakes out. As regards the kind of like left wing base, right, the people on the ground who do things like, burn down CDS, that's another interesting question, right? Because the answer is, well, how much of that was real and how much of that was fake, literally funded? I'm sure you remember, right, the pallets of bricks, the Soros
Yeah.
DAs, all of that. Well, if that funding has dried up, if that's become more and more difficult to fund, well, you might have chopped that off at the leg. Now, alternatively, right, if we're talking about like the social inclination towards liberalism or to leftism, that's a much harder thing to do. Now, to me, right, if we're looking at like what are our kind of win conditions, right? What are the signs that will indicate like, oh, the left is actually hurting? Well, I think one of them is we're going to start seeing defectors, right? We're going to start seeing people who recognize which way the wind is blowing and decide to change their stripes. Right? There's this idea, and you see it in technology, you see it in kind of anything being newly adopted. There's this kind of critical mass you need for something to become mainstream, and that number, depending on who you ask, hovers between 14 and 20%. And the idea is, once 14 to 20% of people believe something, that is seen to be the wave of the future, right? That is what people are doing. So, for instance, you've probably seen this during your life with technology, right? The way that Blackberries and iPhones went from being something very, very new and exclusive to ubiquitous overnight, right?
Yeah.
That's sort of a similar path. And so, to me, because many, we haven't seen many people defect, I don't think it's done yet. It may never be done in that way. But to me, I think that's going to be the case where we can say, okay, this is actually permanent. This is happening versus this is kind of a flash in the pan, rear guard action.
Yeah. I mean, I didn't even use the internet until 2012 for the first time. So yeah, you're right. I've definitely seen a lot happen as far as the way that technology is advanced and is pushed forward. And so whenever like looking at that as a parallel, then you're looking at a situation. Are we? Do you think we're looking at a situation to where the political shift, uh, like it starts growing in like multipliers?
Yeah, that's a distinct possibility. I think that to me, the question basically comes down to is, can they keep this pace up and will it actually get done? Right?
Mm,
Because if this just turns into bluster, it turns into hot air, right? We see kind of a rerun of 2016. I don't think that happens, right? If there's really no kind of force behind it. But if this, is a situation in which, oh, this is actually happening and, you know, people are starting to see tangible benefits, I think there's a very real chance that that might happen, right? One of the other things that I think it's important to talk about in all of this, right, is that the, the kind of like the basic lie of populism. Like you said, this isn't organically coming from the people. This is a
hmm.
top-down thing. And so the
Right.
question is, well, can we replace their top-down thing with our top-down thing? And that's conceptually possible, right? That it should be, it's a machine. It should work for anyone. But to be honest, we haven't tried it. We don't know the answer to that. And so to me, right, when we look at something like the left, I guess the question is like, well, can that be rooted out? Uh, I honestly don't know. I'm much more hopeful than I have really ever been. I think that people like us with our sort of opinions are in a much better, much better situation than we have been. I mean, come on. Like, is anyone, no matter how black-pilled, really going to try and tell me we'd be better off under, George Bush again? Right? Like,
Yeah.
it's absurd. And so, in a lot of things, like the reason I keep saying I don't know is because, to be honest, no one knows. And there are a lot of people telling you they know that are basically just making it up.
I think if uh I think if Trump is successful, what I've said to a lot of my friends, if Trump is truly successful in all this investigation, all these reforms and changes to the government structure, um, to the way that employees are hired and vetted, if all that's successful in 2028, JD Vance will become the president. And that's kind of like the metric that I'm looking at, which I'm a much more ideologically aligned with JD Vance than I am with Donald Trump. Um, with Trump's first term, I was not excited at all, given the people he surrounded himself with. But whenever he picked Vance as his vice president, I was like, oh, this is going to be really different. So um, because I am much more aligned with his ideas, or like a Vivek Ramaswamy's ideas of government, are much more aligned with the way I look at government and the structure of government. But the left, and this is gets down into the root of what we're talking about. They're not going to stop. They're going to continue to fight, and they're going to, even if they have to go into hiding for decades, they will pop back up somewhere with some harebrained scheme to reintroduce themselves into the institutions and try to worm their way into the minds of children in order to create this utopia that they have been always trying to create. I am a bit, I'm pretty white pilled when you look at the extent that people are fleeing from the mainstream media. I think if you start seeing the same type of fleeing from highbrow institutions and as well as the gutting of these bureaucracies, I really think that's going to make a large difference within the culture and with what we're seeing. But we are seeing these protest movements held by like MoveOn.org and these left organizations that are funded through these NGOs. that are popping up at these town halls where they're giving these Republican congressmen a hard time at these town halls in strictly red districts, which I find interesting that they're attacking the red districts, the reddest of the red districts, and I think they're doing that so that we get this idea in our minds that the country isn't as far right as we like to believe it is.
Yeah, I think you're definitely right there. I think one of the other things that remains to be seen is how effective is this actually, right? Because to me, and maybe this is just because of, kind of like my work history and other things, but having kind of peeked behind the veil of, what goes on in the kind of like, you know, I would say like the slop industry, right?
Hmm.
The To me, and actually you see this very clearly in Ukraine, there are a number of things that only make sense as kind of internal political theater, right? Like, is that being done to actually change things, or is that being done to sort of, you know, sell a narrative to dyed in the wool believers, right? Like you can imagine the kind of like right wing version of it, SJW destroyed in epic style, versus I don't really know how the lefties would express the same thing, right? But that's red meat, right? That's
Hmm.
something, that idea that, oh wow, even the deepest red chuds are fighting back against MAGA fascism or whatever. And so again, maybe I'm overly cynical, but I don't know how real that is, right? How effective that is going to be at actually motivating political change. One of the things I think is actually the biggest dangers is sort of a reformed Democratic Party, right? A Democratic Party that basically tries to do what they, to be honest, should have done in 2024 and, run a Clinton-esque figure, right? Kind of distance themselves from the, shall we say, the excesses of the 2020 era, and present themselves as, normal and rational. Who knows? It seems like the current closest thing we have to kind of a focal point is we hate Elon Musk, right? Who voted for Elon Musk? These kind of ideas. I don't know if I see that having legs. I
I heard
could be
a
wrong.
I heard an interesting breakdown about why that's the case, and it might be. I think it'd be valuable to get that to vocalize that. If you just give me 1 second, I'm sorry.
Oh yeah,
Um,
of course.
so from what I understand, from what a lot of people are saying is that Trump is moving so fast and doing so much so quickly that the left doesn't have time to focus on anything he's doing. And so demonizing him would be very difficult because it'd almost be like throwing shit at the wall and seeing what sticks. But with Elon Musk, it can be very directive and a direct point of attack because he is working specifically on disbanding the bureaucracy. And so they're focused on Elon Musk because Trump is moving all over the place so quickly they can't gather their forces to focus on what Trump's doing. And I think we can recognize that in the first couple of weeks of this administration when there was no pushback on anything Trump did. And but he did like 5,000 things in like 2 days. And it was because he did 5,000 things in 2 days. They couldn't get their soldiers together to aim their weapons in the direction that Trump was operating.
Yeah, I think there's definitely something to that. One of the other things I think is interesting, and I think that this is a kind of failure of understanding from conservatives and right-leaning people, right? Is that they assume that the liberal mind works the same way that theirs does, right? They assume
Mm,
that they're operating under the same constraints. And you see this actually even what I was joking about before, right? The SJWs destroyed thing. They
mhm.
assume that uh, well, if liberals are screaming and crying, well, that must mean they're actually hurting. And I don't think that's the case. The crying out is sort of a source for strength, right? 2020 is a great example, right? Was the left on the back foot in 2020? No, of course not. They were culturally ascendant. They had a massive amount of power. And yet the whole time they were screeching and crying, you'd assume they were, all being killed. Uh,
Hmm.
Now I think that on, the opposite end, right? That kind of quietness we're hearing is probably an indication that this is actually scary, right? This is actually something that has the potential to hurt them. And, again, I joked earlier about using the phrase, procedural outcomes, but that's how they've gotten an immense amount of their power is by
Right.
setting the so-called neutral procedures, right? You look at something like, the IRS, right? The IRS is allegedly a non-political entity. But, if you've been around for really long at all, I'm sure you remember when, all of a sudden it seems like the Tea Party sure is getting audited. Pete
Right.
Hegseth just randomly got audited, right? Any
Hmm.
number of these things, right? The supposedly liberal or supposedly neutral, excuse me, institutions uh, basically act as, a power base. And so, to me, cutting out that vector of attack, right? Cutting out their ability to set the kind of like null hypothesis, the baseline of government. I mean, that's really a major move, right? That's a big deal. And again, I'm not trying to, overblow it, but if we ever actually were going to get, a real legitimate change in America that would actually make this a real serious country again, that's one thing that needed to be done, right? The bureaucracy needed to be brought to heel. And, while it isn't done yet, steps are being made. And, the fact that, we're seeing the reaction we are, that indicates that people realize this is a very, very serious threat to, them and their power base. And, I am curious to see what the public reaction to that is. Because to be honest, I don't think the average American has a lot of sympathy for these type of government workers. Particularly, and what Elon Musk has been very smart about is one, revealing everything, and two, dropping it in very, easy to sensationalize ways, right? Like we were joking before about the chat room leaks.
Hmm.
And while that was done through Chris Rufo, it doesn't take a genius to figure out where he got that information from. And, the fact that things are deliberately being expressed in a way as to basically make them extremely unsympathetic to kind of normal middle America. I mean, I think that that's a tactical masterstroke.
Well, and the fact that it was less than in 24 hours later, Tulsi Gabbard had already fired and ripped these people of um their uh, their status, their what do you, not top secret
The security clearance, yeah.
security clearance. Thank you. Um, so that was done within 24 hours, and we're always led to believe, well, the procedure, the process, you got to go through this, it takes forever, and it's like, no, look, you can just do it. And so that should open a lot of people's eyes that we've been lied to about the way that government has to operate, that it slow rolls the things that it's not interested in doing, and it fast tracks the things that it's interested in. And so when it comes to, like, when they say that you're going to shut down the government and it's going to affect all these, benefits that you get as an American, these non-essential workers are getting laid off. And I'm like, well, if they're non-essential, why are they there? Like, why is the government using our money to to do things that are not essential? Like, that could better be left to the private sector to operate in. But they always shut down the things that are going to hurt the average citizen the most, because they want you to feel the pain. They don't want to feel the pain. When most Americans think of the government shutting down, they think, "Oh, great, I don't have to pay taxes now for 2 months," or something like that. And it's like, "Oh no, that still operates. That's essential. Taking your money from you and using it, poorly all around the world. That's an essential task." But what you're not going to get Medicare this for this month or whatever. And it's like, come on, man. Like, it's intentionally designed to put the most pain on the citizenry, so the citizenry demands that they, expand government by, twofold every chance they get. And it's a ridiculous notion, because most of the time the citizenry, let alone the politicians voting on these bills, have no idea what the hell is even going into these bills, where this money's going, what portion of the government's growing, why it's growing, and who it's going to benefit.
Yeah, there's definitely there's definitely something to that, right? One of the things that I think is interesting in what you brought up, right, is, what are these people's real priorities, right? Like when something has to give, what gives? And, the answer is never something that's, particularly inconvenient to them, right? And you see this in the way that kind of like people like, Ben Shapiro, right, who has very strong allegiances to countries non-American. I'll
Hmm.
leave it at that, right? And there's something that basically, politics doesn't brook an ant. There is no this and this. One of them always ultimately wins, right? There is a priority. Something wins out. And this is an idea you see in scripture, right? You cannot serve both God and mammon, right? The idea is when there is a compromise to be made, you have to make a decision. One of the things that I think is, honestly kind of, hopeful, and I see in people like Vance, I see in people like Tucker, uh, is they like America, right? They want America to do well. They like the country and they like the people in it. And, look, simply kind of liking the country that they rule is, I mean, let's be honest, that shouldn't even need to be a requirement, right? That should be kind of like unstated. But,
Yeah, it should be a
when you're in a
given.
situation when that's been very clearly lacking, right? When it's not been the case, it's a pretty strong thing, right? It's a pretty strong
Hmm.
leading indicator. And I think one of the things that I see in Vance that I like, and I have sort of a mixed relation to Vance. There are some things I really like about him. There are other things that, I don't, but I'm going to give him credit for this, is he's done an exceptional job of, framing things in strong moral language, right? Like as he said to that, I can't remember which, you know, TV anchor it was, but when he literally said, like, no, you don't have the right to come here. This is my country. Even when he was defending his remarks on the kind of ordered loves, one of the things he said is that, like,
Is that
the idea,
Margaret Brennan or something like that?
quite possibly, who
Is
knows,
that the
right?
one where he's like, frankly, Margaret, I don't care.
Yes, exactly, right? But that
It's
idea
like,
of, frankly, I don't care. Well, to be honest, that's a huge shift in mentality. And, one of the other things I think that is quite important about, Trump is he has redefined the conceptual boundaries. You mentioned earlier the idea that you can just do things. Well, for a long time, we've been told that you can't. And we've been told
right.
that that is simply not possible. That all you can do is manage the decline. You can manage how many illegals come into your country, but you can't get rid of it. And I think that, again, by showing the fact that that's possible, you're sort of paving the ground for, additional work coming forward, right? You have shown that no, these are up for debate, right? This is something that can be changed. And I think it will be very, very difficult for the Republican Party to be able to go back to, their designated spots as the kind of, Washington generals of politics, right? The ultimate losers, the people who always end up recanting and going back because their base has been shown, oh no, this is possible, right? This isn't something you are, just categorically unable to do. You're just unwilling to. And I think
Hmm.
that that is another kind of like dramatic sea change.
Yeah. And, you know, these people are so the media, the way the media covers this, it's so it's so predictable and so dishonest, which I mean, media and dishonest, it pretty much is synonymous at this point. But then you're starting to see like uh, terror cells pop up. Have you heard about the attempted bombing at Tesla?
Yeah, I haven't been following it super closely, but I'll put it this way. I saw a photo of the guy who got busted for it,
Hmm.
and no surprise. Like similarly, I don't know if you were following this, that there seems to be some kind of like radical trans cult, in kind of like
Yeah,
the
yeah,
northeast of the country.
yeah. What did how did that article read? A trans vegan death cult? It's like,
Which I mean,
uh,
I'm gonna be honest, like I disagree with every one of those sentences, but like you got to admit it's kind of hardcore. Like if you're gonna go for it, right? Like don't be just some kind of like boring, like college campus leftist. But this is actually
right.
something that I was talking to Aaron McIntyre on his show yesterday about, right? Which when we discussed the intelligence leaks of the kind of like weird transgender sex chat room, right?
Hmm.
Was basically, when we were talking earlier, we were saying that, one of the things that is likely to be a leading indicator that something's actually changed has been defections. And I think that that's still true. But the other thing we have to admit is that there are some people who are quite literally too far gone. They have fully and totally bought into it, right? Like this isn't your nephew who went to school, got a little bit liberal, and then by the time he's 30, he, is, kind of a yuppie type, right? Watching Tucker and, Joe Rogan and stuff like that. But there are some people who've made real sacrifices, right? They literally sacrificed their body, for this kind of, state civic religion. And, I think that those people, very few of them, if any, are going to be able to convert. Well, certainly some are, right? We've seen lots of people, quote unquote, detransitioning in recent months, which I think is a good thing, right? I hope that all of them do. But
Hmm.
there are some people who are sort of unable to do so, right? They've bought
Yeah.
in hook, line, and sinker. And do I think that's the majority? No, I don't. But I do think that there are this like hardcore of, tranissaries. There are this hardcore of people who realize the only way they will ever have, social status, the only way they will have, a decent job is if this ideology is, reigns supreme. And I think those people are going to be very, very hard line. Now, look, again, like I said, we're not looking for kind of a populist victory here. We're not looking for 50 plus 1%. But look, the left isn't gone. Those people still exist and will likely
Yeah.
exist for a long time. It's just, they've had some of their, funding cut off, right?
Right. And that was kind of, I had told you this at the beginning. That was one of the things I was thinking of when I see the celebrations of what's going on and, you know, quote unquote owning the libs going left and right. I can't help but think, we watched communism fall in the early 90s and the left never disappeared. They just came back in a different form, you know? And yeah, there was a significant number of them that already had their claws in the institutions of the United States, going back as far as probably the 50s, maybe the 40s. But at the same time, we can't get over our skis here. We gotta stay focused and understand that it's going to be a constant fight, probably for the rest of our lives, dealing with these leftist forces that are going to continuously try to subvert and overthrow our government. And we do have to be aware of what's going on. I want to ask one last question. We've been going an hour. I want to be respectful of your time. I don't want to keep you too much longer. But when you're watching the it's hard to say it any other way, but other than the deterioration of our modern left as it is, and you see these death throes that they're in at the moment, and they're flailing around. How do you imagine that they are going to continue to propagandize? Because like one of the things that really surprises me is I listen to people that are on the left that are genuinely smart, but they buy in to a lot of these idiotic narratives. And it blows my mind that seemingly smart people could be, propagandized in the way they are. And I would like to think that seeing like seeing the results of what's happening now will snap them out of it. And so I'll go and I'll listen to them, and they're just repeating the same talking points the mainstream media is repeating. And I just, how do you see that? Do you think that there's going to be, I imagine there's going to be more converts into the right hemisphere politically. But what do you think is the move as far as what's the block, and how is the media going to rebound, and the propaganda going to rebound from this defeat?
So again, I'm going to pull from Moldbug, right? And he has this line where he says, "Success is having your own ideas explained to you by someone who's completely retarded." Right. And his idea there, it's kind of a joke, right? But what he's saying is that, whenever an idea becomes massified, right, when it catches on, it inevitably becomes dumbed down, right? The version that, people kind of adopt is always one, late, but also, it's not the most intelligent version of it. I think that that's definitely something we will see. As far as the media, I think it's actually important to say that the media appears to be trying to distance itself from, like, the extremity of kind of woke ideology, right? Joy Reid is done. Lester, what's his name? He's done too. We have Jeff
I don't know.
Bezos.
Fox News is calling that trans bomber her, which is weird,
Mm,
but
Well,
yeah.
well, and again, right, this does not mean fully done, right? But there's kind of a cultural move against it. Similarly, right, the kind of cultural cachet around certain social issues is kind of dying down. Is that permanent? I don't think so. But I think that it's been kind of proven that those are losing issues.
Mhm.
Uh, to be honest, I don't really know where media goes from here, right? Because really, the situation we've been in has been kind of, really since about 10 years ago, has been Trump outrage. And it seems like, and you can hear people like Kyle Kulinski, people like Hassan Piker complaining that their money is down, even immediately after Trump's election, right? It seems like the energy is gone there. People are
Hmm.
no longer interested in supporting that. And I think we don't know. I don't think we, in the same way that I'm not really entirely sure what the locus of resistance will be, I'm not entirely sure where, media goes from here. Uh, as far as, the kind of like on the ground people, uh, again, like I said, I think that, certainly some people will begin to defect. Certainly some people will, much like Moldbug said, kind of adopt a stupider version of, the things we believe. Uh, but honestly, what I think and what I hope for is that effectively, political energy is spent, right? You already see this in, media. A lot of what we're seeing now that's still like ultra woke, like if anything, let's be honest, that was shot 2 or 3 years ago, right? The kind of political tenor is it's quieting down, right?
Hmm.
People aren't as freaked out about politics. And I think that that's honestly a much healthier thing. Like, let's be honest, Trump has been normalized to a certain degree, right? You
Right.
have the fact that you have multiple, Fortune 10 CEOs, even before the election, appearing with him, congratulating him. You know, Zuckerberg is basically, making a mea culpa. And admittedly, I think he's a spineless, dirty rat, but nonetheless, right, the extreme social stigma of, you know, being seen with Trump is kind of gone. And don't get me wrong, there's a danger in that, right? There's a possibility that Trump gets absorbed into the blob. But I think at least for the moment being, that kind of like breakneck political pace has left a lot of people, particularly on the left, feeling very, very demotivated. And even in the reaction to this, right? Like you remember after, 2016, there was the massive, the women's riot. There was the, oh, what did David Hogg do? Whatever march that was, right? Like all of these kind of
Mm.
mass demonstrations. And, there's been none of that. It seems like their energy is completely and totally gone. And, again, I'm going to keep going back to this analogy of the body blow, right? If you're already, your hands are starting to drop, you get hit with a big body blow. It's like there's not much energy left in the tank. And that's true both, socially, spiritually, but also the fact that Trump is going after these people's pay, right? He's literally getting rid of, their time and money to oppose him. And I think that it's really no shock that we're seeing a real lack of energy.
Well, all right, man. Any final thoughts? And if not, plug away.
Yeah, sure. So my primary output is the Jay Burden Show. Post twice a week. You can find the Jay Burden Show on Apple, Spotify, YouTube, anywhere you listen to podcasts. And what that is, it's an hour-long interview show. You might have figured out the format. It's not exactly revolutionary, but I talked to a lot of our mutual friends. I was looking over your feed, and there's a whole lot of crossover there. So I highly recommend you check out my work. And again, man, thank you so much for having me on.
Yeah, no doubt. I will definitely make sure to put a link to your show, and I'll definitely start listening to your show. I'll go subscribe right now so that I can start getting those updates as soon as they come through because I was not aware that you did your own show. And so here we go. I get something new to put on my plate and see if I can't keep up with it. So, but I appreciate you coming on, man, and I'm going to stop the recording.